Hello, folks. I don't know when you're watching this, but at the time of recording, it is currently August 2024. And if you're wondering why that's relevant, it's because during August 2024, there has been a series of mass riots, protests, and general civil unrest all across the UK. And being a British citizen myself and one well versed in sociological matters, I've had a lot of people, particularly internationally, ask me my thoughts on such phenomenon. However, we have a phrase in the UK that goes, today's newspaper is tomorrow's toilet paper, which means that what people are talking about now in August 2024, people won't necessarily be talking about in September 2024 or 2025, 2026, 2027, etc. And I have a little rule in that every production or lecture I make must be what I call evergreen, which means that you can watch it at any time and it'll make complete sense to you. And so, rather than talk about the specifics of this civil unrest, occurrence in August 2024, I thought that I would rather zoom out, right? So rather than looking at the micro, let's look at the macro of the underlying reasons why such civil unrest may occur, and hopefully we can try and prevent such problems from occurring in the future by understanding why they might occur and the underlying sociology behind it. And so I want to talk today really about why the UK is a house of cards. And we're going to start off with number one, the immigration crisis. So this is a chart here of UK migration data from the ONS, Office of National Statistics. So these are official figures. You couldn't really get better figures than this. And as you can see, there's 3 lines. Starts off in 1964 all the way to 2021. The blue line is immigration, so the amount of people coming into the UK. The black line is emigration, the amount of people leaving the UK. But the grey line, which is the only line that really matters, is net migration. And that is essentially the difference between immigration and emigration. That's the real number of the amount of people, like the real population change, if you would. And as you can see, the first half of this chart is very unusual in the sense that during 1964 to 1997, there was roughly more people leaving the UK every year than coming in, right? So there was more emigrants than immigrants. So usually people, British citizens perhaps moving to places like Canada or Australia or New Zealand or other sort of Commonwealth nations, or maybe even just the United States. And there were still people coming in, but the amount of people coming in wasn't really significant enough to ever make a dent, right? I mean, you had a few tens of thousands of people at most, but when you have tens of thousands of people coming in with a country of over 60 million people, or 50 million people, then I suppose you could say at the time, it's not really noticeable or really that significant. But then you see the second half of this chart here, and there is, after 1997, there hasn't been a single year where emigration has been higher than immigration. As you can see by the grey line there, it has never been below 0 since 1997. And not only that, but it's been higher since 1997, the amount of people coming in, than any other year before. And especially near the end there around 2021. In fact, if that chart is correct, which I'm sure it is, there are more people came in the UK in 2020 and 2021 alone than more people came in the UK from 1964 to about 1997. So more people came to the UK in about 2, 3, 4 years than in decades when the chart was in the green section. So obviously, if you look at this chart, something happened in 1997, right? You have a relatively stable population before, more people leaving, some people coming in, but it's not really that significant. And then afterwards, it's just hundreds of thousands of people, almost a million near the end there. So what happened in 1997? What's going on here? Well, in 1997, the UK became what I call a house of cards. And this is the house of cards. Now, I understand looking at these cards, you're probably thinking, what are you talking about? Like what do these cards mean? But the House of Cards is a metaphor that I've come up with, and I think if you understand this metaphor, you can take almost any problem in the UK, look at these cards, and you'll be able to reverse engineer why the problem exists. Okay, so while these cards don't mean anything to you right now, or where they've been strategically placed, as we go through this metaphor, you'll understand it, and, well, you'll be able to understand why the immigration crisis occurs and a bunch of other problems the UK has as well. So let's start off with the first card, and that is the P card, P for peasant. So the peasant, you could describe the peasant as like the average worker, right? Low skilled or high skilled, it doesn't matter. They're the average Joe, the salt of the earth people. So things like delivery drivers, secretaries, baristas, nothing against these professions, by the way, but just average jobs that people do. And they're the average people, right? Very easy to understand. The peasant is the average Joe, salt of the earth people. And, the average person has a desire for a well-functioning state, such as great public schools, hospitals, transport, police, housing, etc., because of course they do. Right? I mean, these people, they're not millionaires. If you're in the UK and you get sick, you probably don't have private healthcare. So you use what? Use the NHS, which is, of course, publicly funded, National Health Service. If you have offspring, you probably don't send them to a private school and pay tuition fees of tens of thousands of pounds a year. Can't afford that. So what do? You send them to a public school. You might use public transport, like the tube, or buses, or trains, for example. Like, the average person relies on the state in the UK quite significantly in numerous sectors of life and via numerous institutions, okay? And so obviously the average person wants these public services to be well-funded and healthy and good. So, they want a good, healthy state, obviously. And so they have an incentive to vote for political parties that are more collectivistic, such as those who are socially conservative and economically socialist, right? So the reason for that's simple. Social conservatism is very stable and it's very predictable, right? You've got man marries woman, they have offspring, end of story, right? There's no unpredictability like polycules or something like that, right? There's no surprise pregnancies. People who don't have a lot of things, it's wise for them to want a socially conservative environment that's very stable. And social conservatism is inherently collectivistic as well, which if you don't have much as an individual, psychologically, that makes a lot of sense. But these people also drift towards economically socialist policies for obvious reasons, because they want a strong state, strong public services, even if that's not necessarily good in the long term, right? Because government public services tend to be run very poorly compared to private ones. It doesn't matter. The instincts remain there. People, they're a combination of people that want stability at all costs, even if that means a stronger state that can help them out, right? And this makes complete sense. Whether you agree with this kind of thinking or not, it makes complete sense. This is what the sort of the peasant wants, okay? But then at the other end of the spectrum, you have K for the king, all right? And you've got to think of the king as highly successful businessmen, right? So think executive, bankers, investors, people who manage money, they understand the economy, they understand finances, they understand management, organizing large corporations. And, these people, they work very hard. A lot of people on the left, they hate these people. They say you're a capitalist pig and all this nonsense. But in reality, these people are needed people. These are the people that drive growth, competition. They start industry. These are the people that make countries wealthy, and they provide products and services, or more accurately, the companies they run do so, that enrich everyone overall in the end. And so these people are not bad people by any stretch of the imagination. However, there is a bit of a problem, and that is that they desire to maintain and maximize their own personal fortunes via their lucrative business interests, and that's it. Okay? So if you're a wealthy person, you don't rely, unlike the peasant, on public services. You can afford to have private healthcare. You can afford to send your offspring to private schools. You might have your own private driver, etc. If you're a millionaire or a billionaire, and you have a lot of disposable income, you're not reliant on the state. Right, of course you're not. In fact, the state is a burden. The state, you associate the state with red tape, bureaucracy, taxes, right? Like these are things that the state really, when you're a highly successful businessman, is an enemy in many ways. It's just this obstacle. It's just this nuisance that gets in the way. Maybe enemy is a strong word, but it's definitely a nuisance. And so you have an incentive to vote for political parties that are more individualistic, right? Such as those who are socially progressive and economically conservative, because these parties will advocate anything, right? It's all about the individual. It's all about you. And so, if you have a socially progressive political party, they might be open to some sort of more state reforms. If you have an economically conservative political party, that means low taxes. That means less austerity, less for public services. So you can see where this is going, right? The peasant and the king, as two groups of people, have desires and incentives that are polar opposites, right? They're completely unaligned. The peasant, because he is individually weak, wants a strong collective. He wants a strong state, right? He wants a good state for him and his family and his friends to live in. The king is individually strong, and therefore any form of collectivism is useless to him. And so he wants it minimized as much as possible. He wants to enrich himself, right? And so now by the way, you might say, well, is this anything new? Isn't this always been the case throughout history? But not necessarily, because back in feudal times, when there literally was a king, right? The king wasn't just a metaphor. There literally was a king, and the king ruled the kingdom. It would look really bad if the king's subjects were treated badly, and potentially he might be dethroned, right? It's in the king's best interests for his kingdom to be well maintained. But when the king is a metaphor for capitalists or billionaires and millionaires or successful entrepreneurs, bankers, etc., they don't really have any loyalty to the state necessarily in a globalized international economy. In fact, the state is, as I said, is a burden, and you can quickly move from one state to another anyway when you've got money. So what does it matter, right? So this is an unusual modern day 21st century phenomenon where those at the bottom and those at the top have desires and incentives that are polar opposites. Which brings us on to another card. The card of O, the outsider. So the outsider is mostly low-skilled workers, but they've been imported, right? So think delivery drivers, cashiers, fast food. So these are essentially immigrants. And most immigrants who are imported into the UK are low-skilled workers. There are some high-skilled workers, of course, like doctors, etc., scientists and whatnot. But for every high-skilled worker the UK gets that is imported, there's about 10 who are low-skilled. Okay, and the outsider has a very innocent desire for the most part, and that is to have a better life economically, but sometimes also socially, than in their country of origin, right? I mean, you wouldn't move from your home country to another unless you thought you were going to get a better life. And if you're moving from a poor country, getting a better life economically in the UK is pretty much guaranteed. But if you're also oppressed in your home country, like for example, if you were a gay person in a strong religious state, moving to the UK where you'd be more accepted for social reasons obviously also makes sense. But most of the moves are for economic reasons, right? So people move because they want a better life economically. But they have an incentive, therefore, to vote for political parties that are more individualistic, such as those who are socially progressive and economically conservative, just like the king. Because a socially conservative political party wouldn't want outsiders, and nor would an economically socialist. The Conservatives wouldn't want outsiders because they would fear multiculturalism, and they wouldn't want their culture to change, which is completely understandable. The Socialists wouldn't want outsiders because outsiders would lower wages, especially when the majority are low-skilled workers, for the people already there, right? The peasants, who are also low-skilled, right? Like if a city has, for example, double the delivery drivers from one day to another, the price of the amount of wages that delivery drivers are going to get is inevitably going to go down because the supply is up and the demand is the same, right? And so outsiders, what essentially happens here is you've got this complex sort of love triangle of sorts where As we said, the peasants and the king have desires and incentives that are polar opposites. But the peasant and the outsider, their desires might be similar. They might want a good life, etc., etc. But their incentives are polar opposites. The peasant has an incentive to vote for socially conservative and economically socialist parties, where the outsiders are kept out to protect their own already low wages from competition. But the outsider has an interest, can vote for the same political parties that the king does, because they want to remain, right? They don't want to be deported, or they want to have that stability. And so you have this complex web where the king and the outsider, the king's just looking out for himself, the outsider's just looking out for himself. Like, they don't really care about each other, but that they are mutually aligned because their presence benefits each other. The king benefits from lower wages. He can hire people for lower wages, right? In many cases, by the way, a lot of immigrants, outsiders who come into the UK are paid below minimum wage. Not even legal wages, right? They're treated almost like, just treated terribly. And so that that benefits the king, and it benefits the outsider, because even if he's getting paid peanuts, it's still better than the wages where they came from. But the only person who doesn't benefit here is the peasant, because the peasant has more competition in low skilled jobs, and so the peasant's kind of on their own in a way, right? And so the king and the outsider somewhat work together. The peasant is on their own, and they feel isolated. And that brings us on to another card, which is C, the Crusader. So the Crusader are people who oppose the status quo, mostly from low-skilled backgrounds, conservatives, nationalists, or OG socialists, as I've called them. So think peasants who are from low-skilled jobs, who have had their jobs displaced by more competition from outsiders, or perhaps they've had to live amongst outsiders, and then you've got multicultural clashes, for example. So you've got a combination of social and economic problems. The Crusader are peasants who, again, mostly from low-skilled backgrounds, who sort of transform from being a peasant into this new sort of activist class, this sort of Crusader class. And their desire is to end the collusion between the king and the outsider, at enriching themselves at the cost of the state overall. Right? Basically, the Crusader says to the king, you need to stop importing people into the country, because my life is getting worse as a result, either through multicultural clashes, people from different cultures not getting along, or the economic reason, which is that I'm getting paid less, I can't find a job, I'm out of a job, there's too much competition, house prices are going up. And so that's another thing, house prices. If the amount of people coming into the country is much higher than the amount of houses that are being built, then obviously house prices are going to go up, which is one of the reasons why young people can't afford houses. So the Crusader are people who, they see what the king is doing and they're angry about it. Now, many of them tend to blame the outsiders for this, right? They tend to get angry at the outsiders. In reality, it's the king who's the real orchestrator, but many of them don't see that. But nevertheless, they don't like the king and they don't like the outsider. And so they have an incentive to work with political parties, not just vote, but they work with political parties that are more collectivistic, so socially conservative, economically socialist, right? So the Crusaders are essentially, these are the people that make a ruckus about the state of the modern UK. And again, mostly from low-skilled backgrounds, because they're really, really tired, they're really, really angry with being screwed over. And so, again, exactly what I just said, the peasant can evolve into a Crusader if they're brave or perceptive. The perceptive peasants will be more intellectual and as a Crusader and will blame the king. The ones who are not that perceptive will blame the outsider, right? But in reality, as I said, it's the king that is really the orchestrator, right? Like, outsiders didn't just appear from nowhere; they were invited in, and they were invited in by the king, right? But nevertheless, which brings us on to another card, which is R, which is the Rubbe. And the Rubbe is almost the exact opposite of the Crusader. These are people who support the status quo, mostly from high-skilled backgrounds. So think progressives, liberals, moderates. So People from high-skilled backgrounds are less likely to be affected socially and economically by a huge influx of outsiders. Why is that? Because most outsiders are low-skilled, so they can only afford to live in areas where other low-skilled people live, and also there's not a lot of job competition amongst high-skilled. If there's not a lot of high-skilled outsiders coming in, then high-skilled natives who are high-skilled are not going to be as angry at outsiders, right? I mean, it's just common sense, and so high-skilled people tend to they reject the Crusader, and they have a desire to defend the outsider who they see as as completely innocent from the Crusaders, even if that means defending the king, which they often claim not to like, right? And so their incentives are the opposite to the Crusaders. They work with political parties that are more individualistic, socially progressive, economically capitalist, right? And so it's the opposite of the Crusader, the Rubbe. The peasant who is high skilled evolves into a Rubbe, shields the outsiders from the Crusaders. Essentially says, like, what's wrong with you? Like, you're a terrible person. Like, the Rubbe doesn't understand how the Crusader came to be. Like, why are you blaming the outsiders? Like, why are you so angry? Like, what's wrong with you? Because they don't understand multicultural clashes. They don't understand economic competition. It just doesn't affect them. And so they defend the outsider, but they also defend the status quo, which is the king. And the Rubbe doesn't necessarily know they're defending the king, right? In fact, many Rubbes, if you ask them, what do you think of the king, millionaires and billionaires, they'll have a very negative opinion. They'll say, oh, we don't like these greedy people, these greedy bankers or whatever. But, the reality of the situation is it's the Rubbe who keeps this arrangement going, right? So hence why they're called the Rubbe. And then this brings us on to our last card, because, well, why would the Rubbe do this, apart from not understanding why the Crusader exists? Well, the Rubbe is egged on by the last card, which is, of course, Q, which is the Queen. And the Queen is essentially people on the frontier of institutions. So think academics, journalists, celebrities, right? And the Queen has a desire to have relevance of some kind higher up the totem pole of society, such as respect or notoriety, in order to feel important. So these are people who, they want to feel like they're intelligent and important and have a good role in society. And they're incentivized to do this by assisting the king in manufacturing an illusionary reality that maintains Rubbes, defends outsiders, demonizes Crusaders, and ignores peasants. Right, so you've got to think, the Queen, academics, right, education, journalists, the media, celebrities, right, entertainment. The Queen forges a reality for all those under them. She dictates how reality is. I am the news, I am education, and I will put your faith in me and I will tell you how things really are. That's what the Queen does. The Queen shields the king. The king kind of funds the Queen. Right, and the Queen serves almost as like an intermediary between the king and the Rubbes, if you would, because remember, the Rubbes don't really like the king. So the Queen is a very important, almost like gatekeeper to the truth. Like she hides the truth. Or perhaps more accurately, she takes the truth and warps it and presents a false narrative to keep the whole house of cards running, essentially, right? So. So she'll say things like immigration is good for the economy, and technically that's true. Like, immigration makes gross domestic product go up because there's more people and there's more economic activity. But it doesn't. What they don't tell you is that immigration is good for the king, for the wealthy businessman, because they can. But it's not good for the people at the bottom of society, the peasants who have their wages completely too much competition amongst them, so they're driven down. Like they don't, or they can't afford a house anymore. They don't. So the Queen will conveniently ignore, the fact that houses are unaffordable, or that people at the bottom of society don't get paid as much as they used to, or their wages are flatlined. She'll ignore that, but she'll tell you a half truth, like immigration's good for the economy, which is technically true overall, but it's not true when you look with a magnifying glass and see what she means by that. So the Queen keeps the peace of the House of Cards. She works directly for the king, but she keeps the reality illusionary, right? She keeps the Rubbes maintained, if that makes sense. And so, when you look at things, again, when you understand the House of Cards, you can reverse engineer almost every problem the UK has and understand it. So, what happened with UK migration? In 1997, the UK became a House of Cards. In other words, in 1997, the UK elected New Labour, the first true neoliberal government in its history, of which its electoral success likewise changed its rivals in the Conservative Party to join them, right? And that's exactly what happened. In other words, the UK became a House of Cards. Neoliberalism, the combination of social progressivism and economic conservatism, rules the UK with both of the two main political parties. And the results, you can see exactly the year it happened, and you can see exactly that it's just continued and continued and continued. And so, again, this all comes down to studying the House of Cards. When you understand all these different categories, the groups of people that they represent and how they interact with each other and why they interact with each other, you can kind of understand why. The king gains from mass migration. He doesn't have to deal with public schools or house prices or anything. Like, they've got the money. Like, they don't have to deal with the healthcare system being swarmed or people not getting school places. You know what I mean? They don't have to deal with that. They're peasants' problems. And if the peasant has to deal with that, as far as the king is concerned, who cares? Screw him. That's social Darwinism. You should have been rich, like the king, right? That's how they think. The Queen maintains that this reality is acceptable and fine. The outsider is kind of, you've got to feel sorry for the outsider in many ways, because they're being blamed for everything, when in reality it's the king who allows this to happen. And then you've got the Crusaders and Rubbes engaged in this culture war that just seems like it'll never end, and no one concedes a single point as a result. It's such a sad scenario, but that is why mass migration that's why we have an immigration crisis in the UK. And, again, you can use this logic to other parts, other problems that the British society is notorious for, such as number 2, the nanny state. So the UK has a clear problem with stabbings, right? I mean, everyone knows this. It's become almost like a negative stereotype of the UK. Like, people, we have a large problem with knife crime in the UK. And so this leads politicians in particular to say things like, we need to get knives off the streets, right? Which makes complete sense on the surface. And you've got stories like this, for example, like, new law could mean jail for owners of weapons such as zombie knives. Offenders with banned firearms could be jailed for up to 10 years, while those with other weapons face jail for up to 6 months. This is something that seems like common sense. Like, okay, if people are going around stabbing people with knives, getting knives off the streets is a good thing. But there's a problem with this logic psychologically. And that is that there is a knife in borderline every kitchen in the UK that is sadly able to inflict serious damage if wielded by someone who desired to do so, right? So, there's a knife in everyone's kitchen. If a lunatic wants to get a knife and go around stabbing people with it, the knives are all readily available. But here's the thing: despite this vast arsenal, stabbings are thankfully nevertheless statistically very rare, because most people don't desire to hurt others. Right, so most people have morals. They're well ingrained in society. Just because there's a knife present doesn't mean they're going to go around and start stabbing people with it. And so that means that the knife isn't really the problem, because statistically speaking, the availability of knives, which again is in borderline every kitchen in the UK, and the amount of people who go around stabbing people with them, these statistics are severely out of sync. Right? I mean, there's millions of knives in the UK. There's not millions of people going around stabbing people. So this implies that the knife is not the problem. The knife is merely an intermediary, right? If there was no knives in the UK, the people who want to go around hurting people would use hammers. They would use chainsaws. They might even use cars or other things that are not weapons but can easily be turned into them, right? So the knife isn't the problem. The problem is that there's people who are mentally ill who use knives to go around hurting people. So what's the root cause of the mental illness? And, here is a chart that I've got, which is live births outside of marriage from 1938 to 2021. And as you can see, in 1940, less than 5% of births occurred outside of marriage, which meant that 95% of people brought into the world in the UK came from married parents. Their parents had already married before they were born, right? Today, in 2020, this is now about 52%. right? So there are more people born to parents outside of marriage than in a marriage, right? Now, why is this significant? Well, it's significant because people raised by single parents, and I say raised by single parents because typically speaking, people who are born outside of a marriage, they typically are raised by single parents. Ultimately, like that's an easy correlation to make. But people raised by single parents are more likely to become addicted to alcohol, cigarettes, and drugs, join a gang and commit criminal acts together, drop out of education with no useful qualifications, be sentenced to prison usually while very young, have severely untreated mental illnesses, and repeat the cycle with their own offspring, all of which correlate to knife crime in some regard. So this is what I don't understand. In the UK, we focus on offenders with banned firearms can be jailed for 10 years, right? Like, we need to get knives off the streets. Why don't you put people in prison who have children outside of marriage? And again, I know that sounds like an absolutely unbelievable thing to say, like, what? But follow the statistics, that would actually reduce knife crime much more than getting knives off the streets. Because statistically speaking, knives don't kill people, right? I mean, people wielding knives kill people. So if you just hyper focus on the weapon and the knife, Americans have this same conversation with guns, by the way. If you just hyper focus on the weapon, you're completely ignoring the underlying mental problems that occur behind this. And the point I'm trying to make with this graph is that if all these things are more likely to occur with births outside of marriage, why are we not doing more to focus on preventing this from happening? Why are we not trying to repair the family unit in the UK to make sure that mothers and fathers raise their offspring in stable environments so they don't become mentally ill or join gangs and then go around in the streets wielding knives, stabbing people with them? Like, doesn't that make a lot more sense to deal with the problem, one of the real causes of the problem, rather than just dealing with the weapons after the fact? I mean, if knives are already illegal to wield in the UK, then the only people who are going to wield them are people who have no regard for the law anyway, right? I mean, it just makes complete sense. It's like, why are you not dealing with the root of the problem, such as the breakdown of the family unit in the UK, than the weapon? It doesn't make sense. But again, actually, things like this do make sense when you look at the House of Cards. You see, from the King's perspective, fixing the origins of the UK's problems, such as broken families, would require huge funding from the King to the peasant, which the King doesn't want. As far as the King is concerned, why should the King pay higher taxes to pay for the poorest people in the UK, of which he doesn't care about and has no loyalty to? Like, why should he do that? Why should the King pay money and invest in all these centres and mental health clinics and all this stuff? Why should the King do that? As far as the King is concerned, it's not his problem. It's his money. He shouldn't have to deal with the peasants, right? And so the King essentially tells the Queen, focus on short-term emotionally charged solutions instead, like bans, right? So you foster a newfound nanny state. And you see this not just with the reaction to knife crime. You see this with everything. The UK is obsessed with bans. Ban this, ban that, get rid of this, get rid of that, ban, 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 ban. It's all the UK does. Because it's easy for a politician to get out to ban something. Like, you just sign something, sign some legislation, it's banned. Congratulations, guys, we've done something. Even in reality, they've not done anything, right? Dealing with the UK's root problems, like broken families, which cause knife crime, one of the real causes of knife crime, is difficult. It requires investment. It requires time. It requires actually caring about the peasants, right? It's much easier to just focus on the weapon, focus on, it's the same thing with drugs, right? Like, there's a lot of people in the UK who get addicted to drugs. Well, just ban the drugs. Congratulations, guys, we've done something. It's like, yeah, but banning the drugs doesn't really do anything. Like, you're still going to have people doing drugs. Why don't you look into the psychological reasons why people start doing drugs, like poverty or, again, broken families, which is, again, broken families is the root of so many problems in the UK. It's ridiculous. But again, the King has no incentive to do that. The Queen has no incentive to talk about these things. Instead, it's just short-term nanny state solutions. Ban this, ban that, ban this, ban that. And the end result is that the problems never really go away. The problems never really go away. They never really get solved. The example I've used, knife crime, for example, knife crime continues to happen in the UK constantly, despite the fact that knives are heavily cracked down on, because the problem isn't really the knife, it's the people wielding them and the psychology that they have. No one wants to talk about that in the UK. No one's interested in that because it's too difficult. For the House of Cards, anyway. Which brings us on to number 3, the hate speech dystopia. Oh man, this one is unbelievable. So I have a little bit of an interesting story for you. When I was really young, and I'm talking about when I was like 5, 6, 7, I assumed, as many young British people did, that I was an American. And you might be thinking, why? Like, why did you assume you were an American? And the reason is because I was exposed to a lot of American media when I was growing up. So almost all the cartoons that I would watch were made by Americans. All the reality shows were made by Americans. For those of you who grew up in the late 90s and the 2000s like I did, you might remember shows like Drake and Josh, or iCarly, or Zoe 101, right? Like all these shows took place in America. And when you watch American shows, when you watch American media, you subconsciously pick up things about America. So for example, the fact they have a president and states and the First Amendment, for example. And so, I used to think, I knew that I lived in this place called Britain, but I thought Britain was a state of America, which is really sad if you think about it, because that goes to show what a grasp that American media has over the British youth. And this is a problem with almost all English-speaking countries, by the way. Ireland has a similar problem where I've heard from Irish people that young Irish people have American accents rather than Irish accents in some parts of the country because they watch so much American media growing up, right? I mean, I doubt this is a problem in Germany and France where you've got these language barriers. But in the UK, where we both speak English and the American media dwarfs ours significantly, American media has a significant effect on young people in countries like the UK. And so, growing up watching all these shows, I thought, when I was about 5, 6 or 7, that the UK, that Britain was a state of America, and that all these things that I picked up, like the First Amendment, for example, freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, whatever, I thought all these things applied to me, right? Because of course you do. Like, why would you not think so? I mean, if we are American and Americans have the First Amendment, then that means that I too have the First Amendment. And I remember, this is a little bit embarrassing for me to admit, but I had an argument with my mother when I was about 6 or something. And she was telling me to like shut up or something, like I was probably being too loud and I was doing her head in, right? And she said, Alex, will you just shut up for like 5 minutes? And I said, you can't tell me to shut up because I have freedom of speech. I don't know where I picked that up from. I must have picked it up from some American show, right? But my mother looked at me and she said, what? She's like, what are you talking about? And I said, I have the First Amendment. I didn't even know what an amendment was. I called it an amendment or something like that. I completely pronounced it wrong. And my mother looked at me with these eyes of glaring disappointment and she said, you are not an American. She's like, and of course, when you grow older, right, when you're not a child anymore, you realise, like, oh, the UK is not part of America. The UK is actually a completely different country and a completely different, like, a continent, and we have contrasting histories. And, like, the things that Americans take for granted, like freedom of speech, well, we don't have them in the UK. Like, the UK, America had the separation of church and state, for example, right from its inception. In the UK, we had blasphemy laws at the same time where you could be, hanged if you insulted the religious, the Christianity, the state religion of the time. Like, just because, and so every young British person who consumes a lot of American media slowly has to come to this realization that we are not like them. Like, we are not American, and we are something else. And this something else is like, this idea of freedom, for example, it does not apply in this country. In this, like, the state may say it does, but it doesn't. Like, we don't have the First Amendment in this country, right? And you sound so, and not only that, but we're actually in many ways a country that cracks down severely on speech, as I just said. So, some interesting stats for you. The United Kingdom has more police surveillance cameras than anywhere in the Western world. And as of 2017, it was estimated that 9 people per day were being arrested for online speech and other various thought crimes within the UK, with 5 leading to convictions, right? So, we don't have freedom of speech in the UK. We still have blasphemy laws. The difference is the blasphemy laws no longer protect Christianity. They protect the new state religion, which is, of course, neoliberalism. And so what I thought I would do is I would go through 10 relatively unknown real-life cases of so-called hate speech laws being enforced in the UK. And these are cases that are not very well known, but all of them are true, and they actually happened. And so I thought we'd go through some. So back in 1999, we have man arrested for patriotic posters. In 1999, a 78-year-old veteran from Liverpool displayed advertisements for the UK Independence Party, UKIP, bearing the slogans "Free Speech for England" and "Remember 1939 to 1945. He was arrested and charged with racially aggregated criminal damages, but the charges were later dropped. And now again, I cannot understand for the life of me what is racially aggregated criminal damages by putting up slogans saying "Free Speech for England" and "Remember 1939 to 1945, which was a war that the UK was on the winning side, on the Allies, supposedly defeating. We were defeating fascism. So I don't really understand how it could possibly be racially aggregated criminal damages, which is probably why the charges were later dropped. But the fact that a veteran in his late 70s was arrested for putting such posters up in the first place goes to show how bizarrely totalitarian the UK, the British state, can be, even with false accusations such as this. I mean, for all you Americans watching, imagine if a veteran got arrested by the federal American government for putting up posters that said "Free Speech for America," right? Or "Remember 9/11" or something like that. Like, imagine getting arrested for that and on the claims that you're racist. It's hard to imagine, but it happened. 2001, man investigated for racist bread. In 2001, a 25-year-old baker was forced to remove a sign advertising that the store's bread was "none of that French rubbish." The police stated that they were investigating the sign under the Race Relations Act 1976 in response to an anonymous complaint. Right, so you get arrested in the UK, or you get an investigation in the UK over banter. The British and the French have been, rivals for centuries, and today there's not much of a rivalry, right? The two nations are pretty much on the same ballpark, and it's more like banter. It's like a brotherly rivalry. Like, they'll make fun of us, we'll make fun of them, and that's all that sign was. It's just a little bit of banter. But again, when you have hate speech laws, the line between banter, humour, comedy, and crime become blurred, and so you have ridiculous situations like this where the police are wasting the time investigating a 25-year-old baker for being an xenophobe over a joke. This happened. 2001, man convicted for being Christian. In 2001, a man held up a sign reading "Jesus gives peace, Jesus is alive, stop immorality, stop homosexuality, stop lesbianism, Jesus is Lord." Nearby demonstrators attempted to physically remove the sign. None were charged, but the man was convicted of breaching Section 5 of the Public Order Act 1986 and fined £300 with £395 in costs. Attempts to appeal the trial were unsuccessful, as the man died shortly after the trial. Now, I imagine a lot of people on the progressive side of the aisle would probably be cheering this on, like, yeah, this is someone who should be convicted. Like, how dare they be homophobic with these signs in public? But here's the thing: imagine this in reverse. Imagine if you were campaigning for gay marriage, and then the police came over and arrested you, or charged you and fined you, how would that make you feel? Like, if you don't have freedom of speech for religious people, that will only cause huge amounts of anger It's not like if you arrest people for being homophobic, it's gonna make them less homophobic. It's gonna make them more homophobic. It's gonna draw them more into being the extreme religious and political arms. Like laws like this, laws like this make some views state approved and some views unapproved. And when the state can dictate what is right and wrong, what is moral and immoral, especially in matters of religion, and that's very important when it comes to religion, because religion is irrational, right? And so it's a belief. It's not like a no. And so when the state gets involved with such beliefs, I can't put into words how unbelievably horrendous, like how much it backfires. If you're a progressive and you read this story and you think that's a good thing, believe me, it is not a good thing, and it doesn't do anything for the progressive movement at all. If anything, it emboldens conservative movements, because they have a right to be emboldened because they're being oppressed for their religious views, right? 2006, man arrested for asking question. In 2006, a 21-year-old from Belfast was arrested for walking up to police while inebriated and asking, "Excuse me, do you realise your horse is gay?" The police argued that these were homophobic remarks and tried to charge him under Section 5 of the Public Order Act 1986. The charges were later dropped. So again, a 21-year-old who's, inebriated. So, you can't really take him seriously. The police are, again, they have an incentive to waste their time on someone clearly being a bit of a joker, having a bit of a laugh, and treating it like the guy is some sort of, serious criminal. Again, these kinds of ridiculous scenarios that are a complete waste of time for the police, for the courts, for everything, they hold up real criminal justice in serious cases like theft or assault, for example. They hold it up because the courts end up being filled with ridiculous cases like a man asking a question about gay horses. It's just ridiculous. 2007, man fined for barking. In 2007, a 19-year-old from Newcastle was fined a total of £200 for barking at a Labrador dog and saying "woof" near police. He had his conviction overturned later that year. I don't even have an explanation for this one. I don't have an explanation for this one at all, but I swear it happened. But yeah, the British justice system is wasting its time on a teenager barking. I mean, wow. This is taxpayer money well spent. 2017, this is crazy. Woman given ankle bracelet for posting Snoop Dogg rap lyric. This is crazy. In 2017, a 19-year-old residing in Liverpool quoted a line from Snoop Dogg's song "I'm Trippin'" on her Instagram page. The line, which read, "Kill a snitch N, rob a rich N," was copied from a friend's page as part of a tribute to someone who was killed in a car accident at age 13. I don't know why you would post a Snoop Dogg lyric as a tribute for someone who was killed in a car crash, but besides the point. Hate crime investigators were alerted to the presence of the slur and charged her with sending a grossly offensive message by means of a public electronic communications network. Very fancy. The judge found her guilty and delivered a sentence which included a £585 fine, a curfew, and an ankle monitoring bracelet. However, this was overturned almost a year later. Imagine being a 19-year-old woman being given an ankle bracelet for posting a rap lyric on Instagram. I mean, this doesn't even sound like something that would occur in a country like the UK. It sounds like something you'd hear in like some like North Korea or something. Like you dare speak out about the great leader, we will put you in an ankle bracelet. It's like you dare post a rap lyric. Like, what is going on here? It's one of those stories that is just mind blowing, just absolutely mind blowing. 2018, man warned for dead naming. In 2018, a screenwriter was given a verbal harassment warning for making Twitter posts that dead named a transgender activist. The exchange arose from a debate over whether legal recognition of a gender transition should require medical opinion. Right, so again, the state is taking a side in a controversial issue that has numerous sociological opinions. And it is determining some of those opinions to be illegal to the point where you can be warned by the state against them, which is just absolutely. But we've seen a lot of high-profile cases about things like this. By the way, J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter, I think she was threatened by the Scottish government over her thoughts on this issue or issues relating to it. Again, it's an example of the state, stepping in and saying like, hey, you are immoral and you are illegal if you hold certain views or do certain things, even if they're revolving around very controversial social phenomena. 2019, man had thinking checked by police. In 2019, community cohesion officer questioned a man over the fact that he had retweeted a poem that condemned gender transitions. While confirming that no crime had been committed, the community cohesion officer stated that it qualified as a hate incident and told the man that his employer might be displeased. The man also reported that he heard the line, "We need to check your thinking." So literally thought crime, like, we need to check your thinking. Like, not even the most dystopian novel would come out with a line like that. It would seem too over the top. And note how, if that's true, the community cohesion officer, whatever that is, it's almost like he's trying to be sly to the guy, like, your employer might be displeased. You might lose your job over this. It's like trying to almost like emotionally manipulate him to backtrack on his political beliefs. It's absolute lunacy. 2022, man arrested over shuring pride flag. In 2022, a British Army veteran was arrested on suspicion of sending by public communication network an offensive, indecent, obscene, menacing message for allegedly retweeting an image of the Progress Pride flag arranged into a swastika. Right, so you've got like the pride flag there. And apparently if you like merge it in certain ways, it can form a swastika. And he found like an image of that on Twitter. He didn't make the image, by the way. He didn't edit the image. He merely, this says it retweeted the image. So he literally just pressed a button. And all of a sudden he's been arrested for it. That is just unbelievable if you think about it. Like, imagine retweeting something, like you're just browsing Twitter, you think something's funny, or you think it's mimetic, you retweet it, boop, there you go. Next thing you know, you're in handcuffs. Crazy. And last but not least, 2022, woman arrested over being a Republican. In 2022, a British woman was arrested and charged for holding up an abolish monarchy sign at a proclamation ceremony for King Charles III in Edinburgh, right? So even if you're against the monarchy, right, the monarchy of all things, and you protest in the wrong place, you hold a sign up in the wrong place, you get arrested for it and charged for it. Absolutely insane. And it's kind of ironic, isn't it, when I've gone through these 10 examples of real hate speech or cases, that Britain essentially created the dystopian government genre, like 1984, V for Vendetta, Brave New World, like these dystopian societies where the government is all powerful and creates these bizarre social orders. Isn't it ironic how the UK, we had all these authors, we had all these stories, they originated here, and yet there's no country in the Western world that is more dystopian in terms of speech than the UK. It really is. It's ironic beyond comprehension. And, when people hear about these the British hate speech dystopia overseas, they have what I call overseas horror, where we've got Elon Musk, the world's richest man, saying support freedom of speech in the UK, right? Like, it's ridiculous. Like, what these people live under is absurd. But what I find, I don't particularly find that interesting because that's a given, right? That's just an obvious reaction. What I find interesting is how the Queen's, or the regime, if you would, tries to justify these laws. So here is a typical regime response. And this is from a British member of Parliament, by the way. It says, free speech is not the same as hate speech. Responsible bodies have a duty to protect people from hate speech in democratic societies. Again, the idea that one man's hate speech might be another man's love speech or truth speech or simply just speech, that is never addressed with these people. It's just, no, there is good and bad, and the government must get rid of the bad and promote the good, and that is, it's like very infantile view of the world. Like, it's just a view of the world that just has no basis in reality. But that is one of the typical regime responses. Like, no, bad people, shh, you shush. Good people are good. That's like one of the regime responses. The other regime response, which I think is really interesting, is I don't know who this guy is, by the way, but he says, I have long supported freedom of speech, but within the law. The laws are set by democratically elected governments. They must always prevail over foreign billionaires. You know, this idea that, like, the UK having freedom of speech is something that foreign billionaires want. And, you know, the British people don't want freedom of speech. You know, damn you foreign billionaires for trying to give us freedom of speech. We don't want it. We like responsible bodies telling us what we can and can't say. We like our democratically elected government with a first-past-the-post system under a two-party system where, you know, you can get 30% of the vote and have a majority of the seats. We love this system. Like, we love this. This is exactly what we want. You know, and it's like, it just doesn't have any basis in reality. You know, the reality is that it's actually British billionaires who don't want the British public to have freedom of speech. It's the British kings that don't want the British public to have freedom of speech because the arrangement that they have in enriching themselves benefits them. And so the British public is ultimately left with what I can only describe as domestic horror. You know, this is a tweet made by the British government, and it just says, think before you post, period. Like, this tweet is real, by the way. I've not edited this. This isn't like a comedy skit that I've put on there, like, oh, you know, the British government will probably post this next. No, they did post this. You know, again, if I was writing a dystopian novel where the British government was like totalitarian and cracking down on their population's speech, I would think that tweet was too. I think it would be too over the top. It would be like, no, they'd be smarter than that. Like, they wouldn't actually post. Think before you post. You know, like, that's just ridiculous. But they did, and it was one of the most. I think it was the most ratioed post of all time on Twitter, because people, not just in Britain but around the world, just find it horrific. Like, what does this, like, what is going on with this government? You know. But, you know, the sad part is, though, that hate speech laws also force the police to pick sides in political matters, often openly. This picture here is not a Photoshop, it's a British police car. And as you can see, it's covered in rainbows and it says Pride on the side. It's like, that's a real police car. And you've got to imagine, if you were a Christian or if you were a Muslim, and to you, the concept of gay pride it goes against your religion. It's a controversial social issue. And you have a problem and the police turn up in that. I mean, you're just not going to trust the police. In the same way that a gay person, if the police turned up, you know, in a police car with Christian crosses and Jesus on it, or you know, Arabic text with, you know, the Islamic star and moon, like, again, they're going to have suspicions, right? You can't have political or sociological iconography on police cars. You can't do it. Like, when the police are viewed as taking a side in politics, the trust in police goes down. But the police don't have a choice, because the police don't make the laws. They merely enforce the laws. And so what happens is this unusual scenario where, you know, let's say the state has decided that it's progressive. Conservative people won't join the police, and so the police now has a fully progressive and a fully progressive police force that has no ideological diversity. And because it has no ideological diversity, it doesn't understand, like, how the general public thinks. It's out of touch with the general public, who is much more conservative. And so I can't stress enough, like, the damage that this does, where when the police, you know, Britain made the police. We had the world's first police force. When people stop trusting the police, the people who are meant to keep you safe and enforce the laws and enforce the rules, when they're viewed more as oppressors, right? When they're viewed more as like these are the people who don't like you, or they want to arrest you for what you think, or your religion, or what you think, that is a very dangerous road for a country to go down, right? If the police are seen as being political police, or police with double standards. Do you know, I'll tell you a story. I wasn't going to tell you this, but I'll tell it anyway. I have a friend of mine, and the friend of mine has a friend, and my friend's friend, he joined the police, and these two had known each other for many years. Like, they'd known each other growing up in school. But my friend stopped talking to his friend who joined the police because he joined the police. Because my friend said, well, you're a traitor. If you join the police oppress us, right? Because he's a conservative guy. And so he says, like, if you join the police, I'm not your friend anymore. Because I can't trust you. I can't trust you. The police are corrupt. They're progressive. You know, like, they arrest people for having thought crimes. Like, I can't be friends with someone who spends his days putting innocent people in cuffs. I can't do it. And this would have been unthinkable back in 70s, 80s, 90s. Like if you were a working class conservative guy and you joined the police, you would be given an applause, like it was considered a positive. But ever since the 2010s or the 2000s really, and the 2010s and especially the 2020s, where the police are seen as this political force, their reputation has really gone downhill, and people don't trust the police anymore in large parts of the UK as a result. But again, the reason why this happens is not exactly difficult to understand. By creating overly harsh hate speech laws, rational minds will find it much more difficult to point out the crimes of the king, either due to cowardice or anger. And the Queen and the Rubbes can ensure that the Crusaders, who are primarily the victims of such laws, are all dealt with as per appropriate, right? So basically, hate speech laws are overly harsh on purpose. It's to keep people in line. It's to make people not even think about talking about how the British state operates, to talk about the king, to talk about, any of the problems that the UK has. It's like, no, know your place, right? You work, you pay taxes, and you shut up. End of story. Like, don't talk about these things. And if you do talk about these things, the laws are so harsh that we can find some little way to arrest you or fine you or silence you in some regard. Like, that's the point of these laws. They're overly harsh. They're overly intimidating on purpose. It's about the king retaining his power, and it's about the Queen enforcing this power, right? And so it's all designed to it's like it would be, it's again a rash. Someone who had the best interests of the British state at heart would listen to the Crusaders and try to understand why they are so angry and what their problems are, and try to calm them down, work with them and fix their problems. But the British state doesn't have any interest in doing that. It's much easier to just take these people, put them in prison, shut them up, call them racist, call them nationalist, call them fascist or whatever, like they don't matter, be quiet, blah, blah, blah. It's much easier to do that than it is to actually solve the problem, because they have no interest in solving the problem. Like, the poor getting screwed over in the UK is a system working as designed. It brings us on to number 4, the imported identity politics. This is a chart from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which is the percentage of pupils taking the GCSEs in 2008 who went on to university at age 18 or 19 by ethnicity. So when you're in GCSEs, are general certificates of secondary education. They're basically like, when you graduate high school, you get GCSEs, right? And as you can see, when you split the British population up into different ethnicities, the Chinese, 75% likely to go on to university, Indian, 67%, Black African, 56%. But then right at the bottom of this is white British. The white British population, only 32%. Who in 2008 went on to university. 32%, right? So this is what a lot of people don't understand about the UK. The UK, despite what this chart says, the UK is not really a racially separated society. It's a class-separated society. And the vast majority of underclass and working class people are white British, simply due to demographics. And so underclass and working class people don't go on to university. And because the majority of them are white British, that's why this chart exists. And so, taking this into consideration, let's say that we went on a scholarships hunt, right? So a scholarship, for those who don't know, is like you can get free money or you can get your tuition fee paid for people who are underprivileged or disadvantaged or not likely to go to university. You can get them paid. Well, according to this chart, you'd think that there would be a lot of scholarships for the white British, right? Because the white British are the least likely by far to go to university. Well, here's some scholarships that I found. We have an asylum seekers scholarship. So if you're an asylum seeker, you can get a scholarship there for the cost of tuition, which is pretty good. You can have a scholarship for asylum seekers again, or the children of asylum seekers. So you don't even have to be an asylum seeker. Your parents just have to be one. Okay, well, that's very generous. We have there is a preference for this scholarship to be awarded to someone who is a resident in the UK, okay, who is female. Oh, okay, well, that's unusual because females are more likely than males to go to university, but besides the point. And from a BAME background, which I believe stands for Black, Asian, and Middle Eastern. Okay, well, that's unusual because again, the white British population, specifically the white male population, is the least likely demographic to go to university, so a bit unusual for the scholarship to cater to other demographics that are the opposite. And what is this? You must meet the following criteria to be considered for this scholarship. Identify as belonging to one of the following ethnic groups: Black or Black British, Caribbean, Black or Black British, African. Okay, so basically you are not white British, basically. What I found was when I was going on a scholarship hunt is there is not a single scholarship anywhere in the UK that could be found to be aimed at white British students in particular. None. Zero. Despite the fact that, as we've just seen, the white British population is the least likely to go to university. The least likely. So why is this the case, right? Like, why is this the case? Well, what if there was someone who wanted to start a white male student scholarship? Well, have a look. Private schools reject philanthropists' $1 million scholarship gift intended for disadvantaged white male students. Dulwich College and Winchester College reportedly turned down gifts amounting to over $1.2 million over fears of breaching anti-discrimination laws. Two leading private schools have reportedly turned down the offer of more than £1 million to pay the fees for disadvantaged white students. Both Dulwich College and Winchester College rejected Professor Sir Brian Thwaite's scholarship proposals, fearing the move would put them in breach of anti-discrimination laws, according to The Times. The 96-year-old, who attended both schools on scholarships, had intended to leave money in his will for white British boys from poor backgrounds because they are the least likely demographic to go to university. Studies have shown that disadvantaged white children perform worse at school than almost every other ethnic group. A 2017 study carried out by the Government Social Mobility Commission found that only 10% of the poorest white students attended university, compared with 30% of black children and 50% from Bangladeshi communities. Despite the apparent educational disparity, Dulwich turned down the gift of £400,000 in Sir Brian's will, and Winchester rejected £800,000 according to the newspaper. A spokeswoman for the Winchester College said that acceptance of a bequest of this nature would be neither in the interests of the school as a charity, nor the specific interests of those it aims to support through its work. She added, notwithstanding the legal exceptions to relevant legislation, the school does not see how discrimination on grounds of a boy's colour could ever be compatible with its values. Sir Brian drew a comparison between his offer to the scholarships at Cambridge University for black students created by grime artist Stormzy. If Cambridge University can accept a much larger donation in support of black students, why cannot I do the same for underprivileged white British, Sir Brian said. And that's a good question. Right, so if it would be against anti-discrimination laws to provide a scholarship specifically for white male students, why is it, as we've just seen in the scholarship hunt that I went through, there are scholarships for asylum seekers, children of asylum seekers, not non-white populations, women. Why is it that only the white British, or specifically the white British male population, cannot have scholarships? And the simple answer is because the UK has ignored its class problems and is willingly imported American identity politics in its place. This is a photo of the current British Prime Minister and the current British Deputy Prime Minister, Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner, before they became the government. And this was taken back in 2020, I believe, during the BLM protests. And as you can see, they're kneeling down. And they're kneeling down over the death of George Floyd back in 2020, which I'm sure everyone knows about. Now, here's the thing. George Floyd's death took place in another country, in another continent, and had absolutely nothing to do with the British police or the British state whatsoever. In fact, it had nothing to do with this country or anything to do with this state. And despite that fact, here are senior, powerful British politicians kneeling down to what is essentially an American problem. An American, in America, it may be true that there's a lot of race polarization, a lot of problems with race in America and race and justice, etc. But this is not the case in the UK. This is the reality. This is our politicians. This is the reality, and this is our politicians. The UK is not some sort of hyper. I mean, there are racism, against non-white populations in the UK, obviously, but the UK has institutional racism against the white British population because, as I described, the UK has a problem with class. The UK is a heavily class-based society, and immigrants who enter the UK, they don't inherit that generational class baggage. Like a lot of immigrants in the UK have their eyes on upwards mobility, so they might start off in the working class, but then they move to the middle class, or they might move to the upper class. But if you're born into a family that has been in the same class for generations, which is often the case with the native white British population, you stay in the same class, you don't understand upwards mobility. So what the UK has done here is essentially they've imported American identity politics that doesn't really apply to the UK at all, because as I said, a lot of immigrants, they have upwards mobility. They don't have that generational baggage where your family has been in the same class forever and doesn't understand like why it's important to enter higher education or save money or whatever. Like immigrants have a lot of upwards mobility in the UK. The native population does not. And because the vast majority of working class and underclass people in the UK are white British, because the UK has a class problem, it makes a lot more sense for politicians to simply import American identity politics with the vast array of the powerful American media, which I discussed earlier, has a huge grasp on the UK. It makes a lot more sense for the British establishment to do that, rather than come to terms with the fact that some of the most disadvantaged people in the UK are actually the white British population from the working class and the underclass. It simply makes a lot more sense for them to effortlessly import American identity politics. And so that's exactly what the House of Cards dictates. It says, by importing American identity politics, even if they have almost no relevance in the UK, the Queen can more easily protect the King, rile up the Rubbes, make the outsiders always seem angelic, make the Crusaders look unhinged, and hide the pain of the peasants. In essence, institutional racism against the native population, especially from low-skilled backgrounds, hugely benefits the king indirectly by allowing his reign to continue with less critique, right? So if it came out, for example, that actually the most demographic, the demographic in the UK that is the most economically disadvantaged is the working class white British population, the entire narrative falls apart, right? Like because then the Rubbes would start to question, well, hang on a minute, why are they more disadvantaged? Wait a minute, could it possibly be because of a lot of competition amongst employers, amongst employment, I should say? Like, what's going on here? Like, the entire narrative falls apart, essentially. Like, the king's grasp on the state, what the Queen has to say, it all collapses if it comes out that actually outsiders in the UK do pretty well for themselves. Many outsiders don't stay outsiders. They can become queens. They can even become kings. They become very successful. As I said, there's a lot more, immigrants tend to have a lot more upwards mobility in the UK. That's not true for the native population in the peasants, for the most part. There is not a lot of social mobility in the UK because the class system is ingrained generationally within such families. And so, but again, that would require effort, that would require money, and it's much more convenient to, kick the peasants to the curb and keep promoting this falsity that, Britain is this highly racist country and, we're horrendous and it's all the white British populations who is to blame, when it's just simply not true. It's, the reality is that the white British are the least likely to go to university, get discriminated against in employment. In the UK, we just had I think a lawsuit that was successful in the police because white British police officers were overlooked for a promotion because they were white British. Right, same thing with RAF pilots. Even in the Royal Air Force, you've had lawsuits that have been successful where white male pilots have sued, I believe, and been successful because again they've been overlooked for employment or promotions, something along those lines. I know the reality is that Britain is a class broken society. The majority of people in the lower class are the white British population, and so they're kicked to the curb. And we import this false American identity politics to hide this fact. to have people focus on that rather than focus on what the stats say. And that's the thing when it comes to sociological problems. I don't want to hear what the media has to say. I want the stats. I want the evidence. I want the graphs. I want the charts. That's what really matters, because that's where you can tell the truth. But here's the thing. Number 5. Let's wrap this up. The house never wins, right? If you look at the House of Cards, it's called the House of Cards for a reason, because it's, as soon as the wind blows over, the whole thing comes tumbling down. And we can already kind of predict how that will happen and see how that's happening now. And for example, first, the Queen's efforts in reality distortion start to collapse, as the more the reality moves away from the promoted narrative, the less trustworthy she seems. So, the best example of this is actually not British, but American. There was a news channel called CNN, and they were having riots or something. And CNN wanted to make the riots seem like they were peaceful. And the CNN reporter was stood there, and there was flames behind him, and the ticker at the bottom said "fiery but mostly peaceful protests." Like, at that point, you just think your viewers are stupid, right? Like, what do you mean fiery but mostly peaceful? Like, it's like saying hot but cold, right? It just doesn't make any sense. And so what ends up happening with House of Cards is that, like, the media, the academics, like, people lose faith in them, because the reality that they are promoting just doesn't correspond with the reality that people see with their own eyes, hear with their own ears, and experience themselves on the ground. Like, the people just look at them like, what universe are you living in? Like, this doesn't make any sense. And so people lose faith in them. And when people lose faith in them, well, second, the population of rubes naturally decreases, because many start to recognize what's really going on, right? With many becoming crusaders as a result, right? People realize, like, okay, you've sold me a false reality. Like, you've been telling me, like, all these terrible things and all these things are justified, but you've been telling me half-truths. Like, you've been lying to me about you've been lying to me about the king. You've been lying to me about this House of Cards and this arrangement and the way that modern capitalism in neoliberal countries works. You've lied to me. And when people feel lied to, they go in the opposite direction. And so rubes become crusaders. And then third, very predictable, as the rube population starts to plummet, even the most cowardly peasant starts to feel confident enough to become a crusader, right? So people who were apolitical, maybe didn't want to get involved in politics, well, now they have the confidence to do so, because there's no rubes. Like, the narrative has shattered. Like, there's no rubes anymore. There's no enforcers. The narrative has shattered. We live in a House of Cards. It doesn't make sense to be a peasant in a House of Cards, right? And so, that's what's happening. But after that, here, fourth, outsiders start to become their own version of a crusader due to increasing tensions, right? It's not like outsiders just want to be, are going to accept, people being rude to them, or people being, people treating them badly. Outsiders are going to become their own version of a crusader, right? They're going to become their own activists, their own defenders against the other crusaders. And inevitably the king is dethroned, starting a fresh kingdom of sorts, but the specifics at this point are by no means clear. Like, to me, it seems obvious that the all House of Cards, like Britain in its current form is a House of Cards, and that House of Cards is essentially doomed to collapse in some regard. But it's difficult to predict what will replace that House of Cards. Like, how, what when the king is dethroned, like when the queen is, when no one believes the queen, when the rubes are no longer rubes, when the peasants are now all crusaders, when the outsiders have their own crusaders, and the king is dethroned, well, what happens then? And that is a question that no one knows the answer to. All that you can really say is that it's seemingly inevitable that the House of Cards collapses. It's possible that the peasants turned crusaders implement some sort of fascist regime. It's possible that the outsiders are actually the one who dethrones the king, right? Depending on the amount of numbers. And maybe the state inherits a foreign ideology or a foreign theocracy. Or maybe the peasants turned crusaders and the outsiders turned crusaders work together. Maybe they merge together. It's impossible to predict. All we know for sure is that the House of Cards will collapse. What comes after it is a mystery. And it would be interesting to see what you think will happen, because it's by no means clear by any stretch of the imagination. But anyway, hopefully you understand the House of Cards, the concept, the metaphor, and what it means. And, hopefully the more people understand this, the less terrible civil unrest and riots and protests we can have. And it's my hope that we can have some sort of democratic change, where the British people realise, like the working classes are suffering. We're becoming a nanny state. We're becoming a dystopia. We're importing American identity politics where they don't belong. Let's reverse track. Let's abandon the Labour Party, abandon the Conservative Party. Let's have new political parties that somehow manage to be successful in our first past the post system. Let's have a democratic revolution of sorts where we have where this arrangement no longer applies and we can all get along, without violence and without chaos, and let's have a better country. Wouldn't that be great? Nevertheless, folks, I hope you enjoyed that. Please comment below. What are your thoughts on the UK being a house of cards? What do you think? What do you think will happen? When the house of cards blows over, like what will be the new political order that takes its place? I'd be so curious what you think. Thank you to the patrons on the Wall of Fame. It's words cannot describe. I always say this, but it's true. Words cannot describe how charmed I am that you continue to support me. All the names and positions are accurate at the time of recording, which may not necessarily be the time of uploading. And thank you very much. If you want to find me on X/Twitter. I don't really post much at all on there, but hey, why not, right? It's always good to be on there, I suppose. All right, thank you very much. I think this has gone on for way too long. This might be the longest lecture I've ever given, so hopefully I know it's a complicated metaphor to understand, but hopefully it wasn't just a bunch of babble, and hopefully you understand where I'm coming from and what the metaphor means, and maybe you've learned more about the British state today. So yeah. All right, thanks for watching, and bye-bye.